Everyone. Thank you everyone for coming back for this very last session of our conference. Our speaker now is going to be Cristine Legare, who is a cognitive developmental psychologist at the University of Texas in Austin. But really to say that that's what she does is really, I think, unfair, because her methodologies and the theories she applies are very, very broad and, well, extremely impressive. So Cristine, please take it away.
Sure, I'm happy to. Delighted to be here. I am kind of frustrated that I'm not there in person, because when Conrad originally invited me to be part of this, I was assuming this would involve actually being in Poland, which is one of my favorite places to be. So I guess I'll take this as a consolation prize, but I expect another in-person invitation soon.
Yes, Cristine, I have said this to David in public, and I will repeat this to you. I owe you guys a trip to Poland.
Well, as soon as we get our plague under control in Texas, we'll be welcome. I mean, to be fair, this would not be the right time to travel across international borders, but I'm delighted to be here regardless. And what I want to talk about today is what I call cumulative cultural learning. I'll be talking about how children engage in cultural learning over the course of ontogeny or development. Also talk a lot about how cultural learning is variable and flexible, highly diverse between populations. So we know human culture is unique among animal species in its complexity, its diversity, and its variability. I would say that's kind of the core of my research interests, is trying to understand this, both at population levels and at the kind of individual level, which is why I study learning. Children inhabit complex cultural ecologies that contain things like knowledge systems, beliefs, practices, artifacts, and technologies that are transmitted and often modified over generations. And that modification can occur very accidentally, kind of stochastically, as well as very intentionally. And those have both have different kind of implications for how learners acquire information, but also for how they transmit it to others. So today I'm going to talk about the development and diversity of the capacity of kind of this learning capacity that I think helps explain cultural complexity and variability in human populations. So I'm using a definition of culture that is common in the comparative and cognitive scientific literature, which is group typical behaviors shared by members of a community that rely on socially learned and transmitted information. I really like this particular definition. I mean, there are a million definitions of culture, but I like this one in particular for a couple of reasons. One, it emphasizes group typicality. It emphasizes social learning and social transmission. But this definition of culture works very well for humans, but it also works well for other species that are certainly increasingly clear, also have a capacity for culture. So I like that it works comparatively quite well. Now, human minds are complex cultural learning systems. Our minds are for the acquisition and transmission of cultures. They've been designed over the course of evolution, and by design, I mean not in an intentional way, but they have been selected for, these learning capacities have been selected for over the course of human evolution to learn culture, which has been useful and adaptive for a great variety of different purposes. Now, the psychological processes that support cultural learning are universal. So things like the cultural learning strategies I'm going to be talking about today, imitation, for example, teaching. So those processes are certainly universal, but these psychological processes are highly responsive to diverse developmental or ontogenetic contexts and cultural ecologies. So I think of these learning strategies as our cultural toolkit, and become equipped to use this toolkit and deploy this toolkit in lots of diverse and flexible ways. So that is what I will be talking about today. I also want to talk a bit more about what I mean by culture being cumulative. Culture is cumulative in the sense that innovations are progressively incorporated into a population or a group's stock of skills and knowledge, and this generates often more sophisticated repertoires. So it's kind of a ratcheting effect in terms of cultural complexity. Culture is also highly variable within and between populations, and it's shaped to at least a very large extent through social learning. So to understand, if you want to understand how children learn, you have to understand how they learn in a context of, well, high levels of social interaction, social information, but also increasingly against a backdrop of really extraordinary cultural complexity. Like the extent to which human cultures are increasing in terms of technological, cultural, social complexity is unprecedented. And the knowledge skills, just the amount of knowledge and technologies and skills that we are developing all have implications for the child rearing context that children are part of. So cultural learning now is not entirely different than cultural learning 500 years ago or 5,000 years ago, but the amount in terms of the kind of processes that children are using, but what they're learning and how they're learning it and the amount that they're learning is, yeah, pretty different. So it's also something to I think, make a note of when you think about how cognitive science is currently operating. We exist in a particular moment in time and point in history, which is highly unrepresentative of the way humans have lived for the vast majority of our very long time on this planet. So we're working with children existing at this point in time in these particular populations, and that's worth considering when we make conclusions about what's innate and what's universal and things of that sort. So I want to remind everyone of that, because that's often not the kind of historical aspect of our work is often not emphasized enough. So we know that humans, including young humans like the children in Vanuatu that are in this picture, are psychologically prepared to learn from others. So they're adept at acquiring the beliefs and practices, the knowledge and languages of whatever human group that they are born into, which I am always sort of astonished by what an extraordinary learning achievement that truly is, and how much cognitive flexibility is required to be prepared to learn just any human language that you're exposed to, or multiple human languages simultaneously, that young children have absolutely no problem doing. There's a lot of cognitive flexibility required, cognitive sophistication required to be able to do that. Now, children are equipped with, I mentioned that cultural toolkit. You can also think of it as a learning repertoire. And these are a suite of universal learning capacities. So observation, exploration, participation, imitation, and instruction. I'm going to talk about all of those today. So I think of them, again, as a suite of learning capacities. They operate synergistically. So they often work together. For example, engaging in imitation would be difficult without observation, although you could do vocal imitation, for example, without actually a kind of visual modality. But you get the point. These are, they often work in tandem, and children often choose or select from this kind of repertoire and adapt these strategies to particular types of knowledge, kinds of learning. I'll also talk quite a bit more about that a bit later. So these learning processes also vary in form and frequency within and between populations due to variation, well, in a bunch of things like socialization values, practices associated with specific educational institutions, particular skill sets, types of knowledge systems. It's worth pointing out that formal schooling, the impact of formal schooling on our cognition, our cultural learning, is not nearly as well documented as you might think, which is astonishing to me because formal education, again, is a very new institution for humans. it's existed in some parts of the planet for longer periods of time than others. But it's, in terms of mass accessibility, we're talking a couple hundred years. And there's still a very large portion of the human population that doesn't have access to education at all. Of course, not to mention what we all know, that even those with access to formal education, there's huge variation in school quality. So all of these things are having an enormous impact on the child rearing, child learning environment. And a big part of what I'm studying currently in my research program is to try to understand how participating in formal schooling shapes cognitive and social outcomes in both, in complex ways, not in a simplistic schooling is better. Schooling is better for some things. It's probably detrimental for other things. So really trying to understand how the system works and how it's associated with particular outcomes. So we know that learning processes operate in tandem. Children possess cognitive and communication systems that have evolved to acquire complex technical as well as social skills. We use, just as one simple example, we use imitation both to learn social conventions, practices, and rituals, as well as to learn technical skills like pottery or cooking or weaving, or programming, for example. So we need learning strategies that allow us to do multiple things. What I'm going to show you next are two video clips. The first one is, it's from the Hadza population in Tanzania. And this is a young child with his grandmother. And what I want you to look for here is evidence of these different learning strategies. So what are you seeing here? So there's clearly participation, there's observation, there's imitation that starts out not looking especially voluntary. The child is clearly compelled to imitate, and also some instruction. So I think it illustrates my point that there are a whole suite of different ways that children learn, and they can deploy all of these in flexible ways. Let me show you another one here. This is from the Bantu population, or a Bantu population in the Republic of Congo. Okay. So one of the things you'll notice here, clearly there's some imitation going on here, learning through active participation. But you'll note that as this youngest one felt a little bit more confident, he moved himself more and more centrally to the shared collective activity, and his activity got a bit more synchronized with the other children. A great example of how learning through observation, participation, and imitation often works. And it's one of the many advantages of learning by observing and sort of starting out in a kind of more peripheral way and becoming more central, is that as your skill set improves, you gain confidence and can be more focally involved. But while you're still learning, you have that space to kind of practice and catch up with your more skilled, maybe more senior partners. So both of these are populations where formal schooling is a relatively recent introduction. In some cases, there's really aren't any formal schools at all in some of these regions. And you're still seeing plenty of not just social learning, but also teaching, especially in that first example. Now, that's not to say that the prevalence of these strategies don't vary between populations. In populations, for example, with very high levels of formal education, there's much, much more formal instruction, and not just on the part of teachers, but on the part of parents. So there's no doubt that the experience of formal education shapes not just how children learn about the world around them, but also how parents educate their own children. There's kind of carryover effects experiencing formal education. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about how children learn. So I'm interested in documenting evidence for different ways that children learn through experiments, through observational research. I do plenty of that, but I'm also interested in what Heidi Keller and others have called the ethnotheories of learning. And this is basically just people's beliefs about how children learn, which are important to understand because how people believe children learn impacts how they interact with children, how they teach children, etc. So just one example, I do a lot of research in a country called Vanuatu, which is a Melanesian archipelago, a small scale agricultural society. Also, they do some fishing. Schooling is a relatively recent introduction there. And we do research there to compare child rearing initially kind of in the absence of schooling, but increasingly to understand the almost in a natural experiment way, how greater like participation in schooling over time impacts a great variety of different sorts of outcomes. And one of the studies that we did in Vanuatu, as well as in Austin, Texas, this is a picture of a mother with her children in a children's museum in Austin, which is a very typical child rearing environment in that particular context. And one of the things we did in this research is we just asked parents, how do you think children learn? And in Vanuatu, this was kind of almost like a silly question. You'd say, well, it's obvious. They learn by watching, they learn by doing, they learn by participation. And in Austin, in the US, they would often say things like, well, they learn by being taught. They learn through going to school, through instruction, things of that sort. Now, it's not to say that children in both of these populations don't engage in that entire suite of learning processes, because they absolutely do. But the relative frequency and form of these strategies do vary in, I think, quite meaningful ways as a function of particular institutions like schools, again, socialization values, all sorts of things, which is a big part of what I'm interested in documenting. So let's go a little deeper into some of these learning strategies. So we know children often learn in the context of social activities. This is good for kids. And by engaging in practices that involve cultural artifacts like these binoculars that you see this little girl wearing. And children acquire culturally specific skills and behaviors by observing the daily activities of ongoing stuff around them. So just learning by watching the stream of activities. If you spent time with infants, infants spend a lot of time doing this. And even simple things like the orientation of babies, the extent to which orientation in the sense of are they facing towards the mother's body? Are they facing away from the mother's body? Are they carried on the mother's torso or the caregiver's torso, father, grandparents, etc., other caregivers? Are they carried on the caregiver's back? Are they facing forward or backward? All these kinds of cultural practices impact what children can observe around them. One of the suite of practices that have increased in many industrialized countries is using these, they're cultural technologies like one of my former postdocs calls them baby buckets. So carriages and strollers and things like that that are used to carry the baby away from the body, all to locomote in the environment, but are not actually on the caretaker's body. The introduction of this particular type of cultural technology has profound implications for what the child sees, for their capacity to socially reference other people. We still know very little about the impacts of seemingly simple things like that on a whole suite of different kinds of socio-emotional, psychological, cognitive outcomes. And we need much more research on things like that. So a couple more things about observational learning. It allows children to acquire knowledge and skills through engagements with an expert and other apprentices during ongoing activity. So the video of those 3 children dancing is a perfect example of this and really illustrates the power of observation. It also allows children to avoid making the mistakes of other people themselves. So you are observing someone struggling with something and making a mistake. You can learn from that without engaging in that same mistaken behavior yourself. At least in principle, it could work that way. So it saves us in some contexts from a rather costly process of trial and error learning, which of course we also do. But observation can really save us from a lot of that. If you have any doubts about this, just watch the presence of a police patrol vehicle on the roads and viewing other cars slowing down because of the proximity of the police. Other cars will slow down even if they're not aware. They don't actually see the police officer or the police car themselves. So people are very, very attentive to all sorts of signals that they learn through observation learning. Okay, so let's talk a bit about exploration. We know that a big part of what children are curious about is understanding why things happen. Children are characteristically curious. And exploration is the process by which individuals act on the world, in this case children, in ways that generate information from others or from their environment. Right? Sometimes children are exploring in the context of people, sometimes not, often in the context of people. And even when they're not exploring in the context of people, they're almost always in the context of artifacts like what you see here, this deconstructed fan that humans create. So almost all of our experiences, especially in industrialized contexts that are absolutely full of human-made artifacts, our experiences are either directly involving other humans or the product of humans by reading their books, by reading programming in their computer languages, etc. So even if there's not kind of a direct social part of it, we're interacting with the product of sociality, put it that way. A couple of things to note about exploration, because there's a potentially infinite amount of things for young children to explore. They know very little about a whole bunch. They know very little about a lot. So they could potentially be exploring all kinds of things all the time. It turns out their exploration is constrained in that children are more interested in exploring things that are surprising, that violate their expectations, that are unexpected, novel, and potentially informative. Also things that are potentially dangerous, for example. And infants and young children both explore unexpected, ambiguous, and inconsistent outcomes and events more than, for example, consistent outcomes and events, which from a learning perspective is exactly the sort of bias that you would want to have if you're using exploration to learn, which is absolutely what children are interested in doing. One thing to note is that exploration and explanation, whether it's articulated out loud or it's a self-explanation where it's kind of internal dialogue, both the process of explanation and exploration work in tandem to kind of further learning, almost in a hypothesis generation and testing kind of feedback loop. So even when children are exploring in silence, they're often engaging in kind of self-explanation to think through what they're doing. It's very useful for parents to ask children to articulate their explanations in order to make this a more a social process and provide other people with an opportunity to give them really useful feedback. Okay, participation, we've seen that in 2 video clips already. We know that caregivers, educators, siblings, and peers provide children with opportunities to participate in ongoing activities. This is just incredibly powerful. And more experienced adults and peers assist children in acquiring skills that are often just beyond their current abilities. This is Vygotsky's idea of zone of proximal development. And you see this kind of very carefully tailored feedback across highly diverse populations. So it's one of the most useful things that, that teachers, educators, caregivers can do for children, is to give them carefully timed feedback when they're kind of right at the cusp of learning something a little bit more complex or a little bit or something that's novel. And they often learn the practices and skills of, children learn the practices and skills of their communities through things like participation and collaboration. And guided participation, which is one of the things I just mentioned, shapes children's learning in a variety of ways, including through explanation and correction. So it helps guide children towards a more kind of productive path forward. And its participation is incredibly critical for complex skill acquisition. There are a good number of skills, I'm sure you're very familiar with, that are exceptionally difficult to learn through instruction alone, through taking courses. Try to learn, for example, scuba diving without actually being in the water and interacting with the technology. From firsthand experience, I can say not all of it translates. So that active experience is important. And as I mentioned earlier, formal schooling here's another example of how formal schooling is really shaping the kinds of things children are learning. Formal schooling is really great at large scale instruction of abstract knowledge, right? There are relatively fewer opportunities, at least historically, for active participation in activities and engaging in skill acquisition through firsthand exploration, which I think it's widely known that introducing the ability to have more of an apprenticeship model in formal schools is critical. And schools that are populations that don't have large scale formal education make extensive use of apprenticeship learning in complex skill acquisition. So I would say that would be one example where formal education is not only not better, it's not better, it's I think detrimental in some cases for some types of learning. Okay, we'll talk about imitation next. I've done a lot of research on this. And our capacity to imitate, which is something that children are very well prepared for. They start to imitate as soon as they have the motor control to effectively do so. In fact, they start even before they have the motor control to do so. As you've seen toddlers kind of hopping around trying to reproduce actions that they're really unable yet, but they still attempt it, which reveals motivation. And this capacity is absolutely critical to understanding cumulative cultural learning, because imitation allows you to learn through both horizontal transmission within generations and also vertical transmission between generations. So it's a very effective and rapid way to learn from others without having to figure it out yourself. So if you want to learn a social convention or a ritual or critical social practices in your community, imitation is pretty much the only way to do it, because it's very much about conformity to activities that other people have already specified. Imitation is really the only way to learn that. And even in the context of complex technical skills, novices always start with imitation. And once they become more, for example, in the context of cooking, sticking rigidly to recipes is a pretty great strategy if you don't know, if you're not an expert chef or baker, and you don't really know any of the underlying, you don't know enough about the kind of chemistry underlying these particular food combinations or food preparation techniques to know what you can modify, what you can change, and what the implications of that would be. As you become more skilled, you can start to innovate more. You can start to experiment with combinations of spices. But I'm sure you've all experienced having dinner with people who don't have that kind of core skill set in terms of understanding food preparation and food, like combinations of foods, and just throw all kinds of things together that really never work out. So there's a reason we have systems of high fidelity transmission, and imitation is it's a big part of that. And it's a big part of why humans have such extraordinarily complex cultural repertoires. And last, I want to talk about instruction. I've already mentioned formal schooling quite a bit. Teaching, I would argue, well, that's a big part of what happens in formal schools. Of course, teaching occurs all the time outside of formal schools as well. But I think it's pretty much, it's not controversial to say that a big part of what schools are for teaching, as well as for learning, ideally. And I think teaching is the most sophisticated form of social learning because both the teacher and the learner, at least teaching works best this way, when the learner and the teacher take the perspective of each other. So it requires perspective taking, joint attention, the careful consideration of what the learner knows, what their background knowledge is, and how best to tailor information to them in order to maximize their learning, not presenting material that's far too complex for them to possibly manage, or information that is so mundane that it's redundant with what they already know. So figuring out how to pitch it at just the right level of your learners is a big part of the mastery of teaching. And teaching enables efficient information transfer. That is why we set up large-scale mass educational systems. It's really that this is an efficient way to transmit a lot of information in very little time. There are many benefits associated with this. There are also costs associated with this particular model of instruction. I did want to point out that there are many different kinds of teaching. So they can be things like stimulus enhancement, also things like social tolerance. So the video of those three kids dancing, the older two weren't engaging in any kind of active instruction, but they were letting that little kid hang out and watch and sort of be involved in the periphery. Right? So there's lots of different ways that teaching can proceed. It's not just through direct instruction. That just tends to be what we think of because most of us have spent the vast majority of our lives in formal educational institutions like this one, doing what I'm doing right now, which is lecturing, which is a form of direct instruction. So we're most familiar with that, but in fact, the repertoire of teaching is much more diverse than that, which is worth understanding. And not only, teaching is interesting to me because to understand cultural complexity, you need to understand not just the ability to acquire information, the cognitive processes that enable us to learn, although of course that's critical, and the information we have access to that we learn, also critical. We also have to understand the fact that we are motivated as adults, but also even as children, to communicate what we know to others. The fact that we take time to educate the offspring of other people is noteworthy. We've set up whole cultural institutions specifically to transmit information to unrelated individuals. It reveals a lot about what our priorities are as a species, and our sociality, our nature, and the nature of human culture. So a couple things to note about instruction. I think I mentioned previously that there's some evidence that the experience of formal education or going to formal education, it doesn't just, going to formal schools doesn't just impact how you learn and how you interact with the world around you. It also impacts how you parent your own children. So if you've been to school, you tend to use more school-like teaching strategies, more direct instruction, a lot of things that look like what happens in schools, which is worth pointing out. And there's some evidence, in fact, that the fact that children in formally educated industrialist populations have spent so much of their time in managed learning environments like schools, because that's what schools are. They are structured for children. Their attention is organized for them. It's one of the reasons why one of the biggest predictors of academic and professional success is self-regulation. The reason for that is that in formal education and later in many professions, you must have the ability to resist distractions, inhibit impulses, and focus, and have your attention externally managed by somebody else for long periods of time, right? That is I would say that's an example of how cognition and environments can match, particular environments can match or can mismatch, right? So for children that have more difficulty focusing on what someone else wants them to focus on, and more difficulty resisting things they find more interesting, they're more of a mismatch with that environment. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything cognitively wrong with them at all. There's always questions about fit between the individual differences in what the human mind is like and particular cultural contexts. And as the contexts fit, things that used to be a match could now be mismatches. We can talk about that more in the Q&A, but worth considering. Okay, to wrap up, we have a diverse repertoire of cultural transmission and acquisition strategies that are really about optimizing the acquisition of group practices, beliefs, and values. And there's the variation in learning processes is associated with a great variety of things. I've touched on just a few of these, but we can definitely talk more about them. There are variations associated with beliefs about learning. As I mentioned, these kind of ethno-theories of learning, types of social organizations like schools, socialization practices and values, the particular knowledge and skills that particular populations need young people and children to learn. Those vary enormously. I mean, those not only do they vary between populations, they vary within populations, and they're changing incredibly rapidly over time. I mean, just think about the presence of electronic technology in our spaces over the course of the past 2-3 decades. Right? Now they are pervasive in our environments. That's recent, right? And it's a very fundamentally different way of interacting with and acquiring knowledge. These learning processes also vary by age, ability, and experience. Really young children aren't quite as proficient at imitation as an older child would be. And again, I mentioned these educational institutions and practices. These are, so schools are an example of that, but there are a whole bunch of other types of institutions that impact how we learn, professional, organizational, occupational institutions that impact the form and frequency of learning processes. I just wanted to mention just very briefly a study that we're doing, a large-scale study that we're doing now called the Culture of Schooling. So we're working in 13 or so different countries around the world that vary in the extent to which they have access and exposure to formal education. And we're doing things like natural experiments, so kind of documenting the impact of introducing schools in regions of the world that didn't exist previously. We're also doing studies using what's called a school cutoff design. So in some countries like the United States, there's a pretty arbitrary date by which a child has to be 5 years old and thus qualify to go to kindergarten. And if the child just misses that, then they stay home another year and don't go to kindergarten. So you've got children of exactly the same age, almost exactly the same age, that vary an entire year in how much education they have. So lots of different creative strategies to understand the impact of going to school on a variety of different kinds of outcomes, like everything from cognition, knowledge, skills, social learning, social interaction, cultural transmission, how they interact with peers. So we are launching that next year. It's been delayed a year, but we're launching it next year. So stay tuned for what we're going to find. And finally, I just wanted to mention that comparative research, comparing between species, but also between different ages and critically between different cultural contexts and populations, has the potential to address some of the critical gaps in our scientific understanding of cultural learning and development. So that's all I wanted to say on my end, but I'm very much looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristine. So, questions, everyone?
You might have to start, Conrad.
I might have to start. People are feeling shy. I think you're being terribly intimidating. I think that's the problem.
I do try to project physical intimidation when I give talks, so I guess I've succeeded.
All right, Michael. We have a question from Michael.
Yeah, hey, great talk. Thanks a lot. I was wondering about the influence of kind of individual propensities. So the fact that you might have the same cultural setting, and you might have basically very similar surroundings, but strategies used to learn a particular thing kind of differ just individually. I'm thinking, for example, about language acquisition, where that they're children with a more holistic learning style, where they kind of try to approach basically, go the way via intonation and learning chunks, and then children with a more analytic learning style, where they kind of really try to get to the individual parts first. And I was wondering what kind of role you think that generally plays for cultural learning.
Well, that I think speaks to the point that I made earlier about match and mismatch. So it depends probably entirely on the context that they're learning in. And some contexts, one of those particular learning strategies might be more adaptive, more efficient, more useful. And in that context, the child would have, a child with a strategy that matched better would have more of an advantage. That's like, for example, the self-regulation capacity for self-regulation I mentioned before is a great example of this. Young children vary. If you've been around young children or older children or adults, you'll notice self-regulatory abilities vary. And those that are more self-regulated aren't smarter or better necessarily. They're just more able to coordinate their behavior to the demands of a particular context. And to the extent that they can do that, there are advantages. And sometimes these advantages they're cumulative, and in some cases kind of catalytic. So if you imagine a young child in a preschool child who has better self-regulatory skills. Preschool kids vary enormously in their self-regulatory skills. There's a whole fascinating literature on that. A kid who has better regulation is going to have less conflict with the teacher, probably less conflict with the peers, probably hear more of what the teacher is instructing. There's a whole cascade of things that this child will experience, so that over time has benefits. But yeah, and I'm sure that's true of language and all kinds of different aptitudes. So it's all about the context and the match for that, at least other than in really extreme cases of substantial impairment. Those are going to be main effects and going to impair a person across a great variety of different contexts.
Right, cheers. Because I don't see any other raised hands, maybe I can follow up with another question. Where does the learning repertoire come from? So I'm thinking, for example, like how what you said has similarities or contrasts with things like Celia Hayes' cultural gadgets approach, for example, where Celia Hayes argues that the learning strategies and even cognitive processes are themselves culturally constructed.
Sure.
Which kind of contrasts with kind of the idea that imitation, for example, is just kind of a cognitive ability that children kind of bring to the table of social learning. So I was wondering kind of about this question.
Yeah, I think all of these are all cognitively very complex and are derivative of other cognitive processes. So I'm not making a hard argument that imitation emerges innate and fully formed, but instead that all children end up there. And there's no doubt some innate universal architecture that supports that. Not necessarily claiming that imitation is wholesale innate, but there certainly are some cognitive processes that associative learning, all kinds of different things that Celia Hayes has described that make imitation possible. One thing to note is that imitation it's interesting to me because it's not just interesting from a cognitive perspective, although it's really fascinating from a cognitive perspective. It's interesting from a social perspective because it's not. You wouldn't be able to understand imitation if you didn't consider how motivated we are to do it. It's not just that we can do it. It's just that we do it all the time from very early childhood, from really as early as we can successfully get our bodies to do it. So there's not just the cognitive ability to, but there's this enormous motivation to do so that is about things like affiliation. A big part of why young people affiliate, or why anybody imitates, is to signal to others that they're a part of that group. It's why children imitate their parents. Yeah, they probably want to learn some stuff, but they also want to be like you. So yeah, I agree that there are many open questions about exactly how the capacity to imitate is operationalized in the brain, and the extent to which the innate cognitive architecture, the contribution of that versus cultural input. But I tend to think about these things very holistically. There's never a point when we're not in a cultural environment. In utero, that's a cultural environment. There's sound. There's it's the baby's influenced by what the mother is eating, the spices she consumes. We are always cultural, despite conversations I've had with some of my cognitive science colleagues who will claim things like, oh, I sort of sidestepped that cultural complexity issue by studying babies. Like, no, that doesn't work. You can't just go younger, as it turns out. That's not an effective strategy, and nor should you want to, right? Culture is the most interesting thing about humans. Instead of trying to kind of run away from it and its complexity, I would run towards it. And it's the most interesting thing about us.
All right, cheers. Thanks a lot.
Christine, the whole time you've been talking, I've found myself thinking about the line that Bob Macaulay has about science, right? That it is unnatural, that the only way in which these kinds of beliefs can be maintained in society is via the support of very specific institutions, right, which have been constructed to maintain those beliefs, right? Yeah. And I mean, it seems to me that my question to you is, would you agree? It seems to me that Bob's line here fits very nicely with what you say about learning.
Yeah, I think that that formal science, anyway, it's very effortful, is very difficult. It requires inhibiting a lot of our cognitive biases. a lot of our intuitions about how the world works. So we have lots of kind of folk scientific, naive scientific intuitions about how the world works, which are largely useful in navigating the world. That's for the most part enough. The problem is we tend to apply all of those things to understanding formal science, and that's where we get into trouble. So for example, our intuitions about gravity and how gravity actually works are not consistent and frequently gets us into trouble. But to navigate your everyday life, our natural intuitions about gravity are good enough. They will get us where we need to go most of the time. But I'm glad you brought this up, because I think it's important to understand what things like institutions that support formal science and these other kinds of very specialized cultural capacities that, of course, human minds are operating within, but really do need extensive education and correction and support to maintain. You can't understand current human cultural complexity without understanding these sorts of institutions, like scientific institutions and institutes and universities and all of these cultural spaces that are really about preserving and driving, both retaining, preserving, and moving, changing, increasing the complexity of culture. And that without these institutions and without populations, large populations of people that have this distributed expertise among them, cultural complexity would fall. It's not as though culture moves in a linear direction towards greater complexity. We can lose culture, we can lose knowledge, we can lose cultural complexity, for example, with the crash of populations. Go to, for example, probably rural towns in Texas that used to be larger, that used to have a cobbler and used to have a tailor and used to have tradespeople, and now just have a Burger King. So the cultural complexity and knowledge can absolutely be lost. It's why we have these institutions and technologies in order to retain them.
Yeah. There's so much more to say there, isn't there? All right, thank you, Cristine. Questions from others, please.
Anything you're curious about, interested in learning more about?
We have a question. We have a question from Kasia Pisański.
Hi.
Interesting talk. A lot of it's really a really great overview of cultural transmission, learning, imitation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about something you didn't really touch a lot on, but I'm quite curious. In terms of, you spoke a little about different strategies and how important it is to identify different strategies for children to be able to learn. And one thing that we hear often is that different individuals, children, adults, learn differently. So there are huge individual differences, never mind cultural differences, but individual differences within cultures. And in particular, that some children or adults learn better, for example, visually or through multimodal platforms. And so what have you learned in your research about that, and how we can identify different individual needs within cultures, and how you can also parallel that with the cultural differences?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a great example of how the way people think they learn best and how they actually learn best are often not aligned. So there are strong intuitions about differences in learning modalities, a visual learner, a vocal learner, this kind of thing. There's not strong evidence that those kinds of differences are really robust and drive individual differences in outcomes. So people have the sense that that there are differences in these modalities, but I think the intuition about this is greater than the scientific evidence for those particular individual differences. However, it is absolutely the case that children and adults vary enormously and that some children find learning some things much more difficult than others. They vary in their cognitive flexibility, as I mentioned, in their self-regulation, in analytical thinking, all kinds of things like that. And I think that the take home there is to think through, given a particular child, what sort of experiences, experiential learning, what sort of input would make the biggest difference to that kid. And it's not just thinking in terms of visual. I think often things like a visual learner is a proxy for things like, I need to be able to experience things myself. I need to explore a space myself. I need to try things myself. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of those things are proxies for the need to engage a much wider part of your repertoire than often schools allow you to do, which is, if you sit there and are for hours and hours on end and bombarded with somebody talking to you all day, or you're a passive recipient of this knowledge, you might believe, actually, this is not the way I learn best. And you would not be wrong. It's certainly not the best way to learn a lot of skills, like actual lived skills. So I think, figuring out ways to make the environments we put children in more, changing the environments to better suit what is naturally interesting to humans, and to your point, to accommodate individual differences in children. A lot of the stigma that it's children who have learning disabilities and things like that, a lot of that's mismatch. I'm not saying that that learning disabilities aren't a thing, but a big part of what you see in this whole kind of educational sciences space is just a mismatch between an individual child who's struggling to conform to the requirements that are placed upon them. And if they were living in a village where they got to interact with their peers and run around and engage in hands-on learning and fish and weave, would have no issues whatsoever.
Okay, really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. I see you have another question.
Okay.
Thanks.
Vlad?
Hello.
Vlad?
I think you're on. Yeah, you're on. You're muted.
I think he's frozen. There.
Oh, okay.
And muted.
Vlad, you're still muted. We're waiting for you to unmute yourself so we can hear your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question regarding Dan Sperber's notions about imitation, because he claims that he spares the term imitation only for the very basic, nearly behavioral mimicry.
Yeah.
He mentions also that the things which are usually called as imitations involve much more inference than strictly saying imitation. And also even explicit instructions, it's like the explicit information is just a part of what the learning individual is getting, and a big part of that is getting from his inferential processes. So what do you think about this kind of
I think that there's Dan has written about this, Dan Sperber, Paul Harris, others. There's a whole kind of spectrum in the context of imitation. Mimicry would be one of them. And a lot of the debate, I think, has to do with how much knowledge there is about the intention and the goal of the actor. So you can absolutely reproduce the motor movements of another person without knowing anything about what they're trying to do, anything about their goals or their objectives. So imitation, from my perspective, can just vary enormously in how heavily involved social cognition is. And it's also the case that you don't need to know the causal basis of what someone is doing in order to imitate them. We don't just imitate someone because we want to learn how the skills they have. We also imitate them because we want to affiliate with them. They're often signals of group affiliation and group identity. And they communicate all kinds of information to other people about who's part of the group, who has inside knowledge of group behavior and who doesn't. So there's a whole spectrum of layers of social cognitive complexity that can occur in the context of imitation. And I don't think it's the case that every act of reproduction or reproducing the behavior of others entail all of that complexity, but it can. That's a big part of what I'm trying to understand in my research program. And that changes, of course, over the age and things like that too.
Yeah. I mean, what you just said reminded me of a lovely study. I cannot remember the name of the authors, but a study of over-imitation, which was done in a science museum, where the experiment was set up as an information board. And the people who were working with the experimenter would walk up as if they were simply visiting the science museum, carry out a number of actions which were unnecessary to access the information. And then, of course, they were over-imitated by the people who came along next and had observed them doing that.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, that's a lovely natural sort of location experiment to try and pull some of these things apart.
And if you're a novice and you don't understand the details of what's happening, and we're all novices in certain contexts, it's a perfectly reasonable and smart thing to do to imitate everything with high fidelity, because you don't know what you can omit and what you can change. One kind of parting example of this, one of my close friends he's an aerospace engineering professor at UT Austin, where I work. And he attended one of my lectures on ritual. And when I saw him after the talk, he looked distressed, I guess is how I would put it. He looked distressed. And, I said, what's going on? Was it my lecture? Is everything okay? And he said, I'm very worried about my graduate students now. I said, okay, well, why would that be? It's like, well, I realized that a big part of what they're doing in the context. So he has to teach his graduate students a lot of very, very, very technical, highly specialized skills. So they have to learn to construct components of technologies in very, very, very precise ways. And so he does a lot of, showing them how to do it. And one of the things that he understood after listening to my lecture on ritual is over-imitation. So he found that his students were not just copying what was relevant to complete the technology or construct the technology.
Yes.
They were imitating all kinds of esoteric things that he didn't even realize that he did. They were reproducing the orientation of his hand, which is just, there's lots of ways you could orient your hand to achieve it. But they were this kind of extreme over imitation, sometimes even like esoteric movements of his body in kind of hunching over. And here he thinks he's teaching them high-tech scientific technologies. And it's like, they're just a bunch of ritual learners, aren't they? I'm like, yeah, that's great though. They're novices. They don't know exactly what to imitate and what not to. And I said, and the good news is, it's clear they really want to affiliate with you. So you should be happy about that.
And
so
I mean, the thing that I love about that again is just how distant we are now in our understanding of, for example, here we have high technology, science, etc., all of these things, and they're so involved with really basic human behaviors that is so utterly different from the picture that people had of science 100 years ago, where it was completely abstracted away from anything like that.
Absolutely. I mean, we created it just like all other aspects of culture, and then change it, transform it, modify it for our purposes. Yeah.
Yes. All right, Cristine. I think we have taken enough of your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for attending. I really appreciate
again.
it. Yes. Well, we'll cross paths again soon.
Sure we will. I'm sure we will. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. All right, everyone. And it appears that we have come to the end of at least the formal part of our conference.